Hello, I'm Dr. John Kruse, and welcome to this week's question and answer hour. So, I will be trying to answer the questions you have about the videos I posted this week. They were on imposter syndrome, and that was a sound audit edit on that one, and a new one on genetic nurturance. And I'm also open to questions more broadly on ADHD and even more broadly on general mental health questions. What other? Oh, everything I say should be taken as general information rather than specific treatment recommendations. And I know there are already some glitches in connectivity today. So if we go down, hopefully it will be briefly, and hopefully Starlink and Elon Musk will start behaving. But I'll go ahead with what we have. So the two videos, the one that was re-released was about imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome is defined, or imposter phenomena, as some prefer, as feelings of inadequacy or doubting your self-worth and value, even though you have significant accomplishments or achievements, and also a fear of being exposed for being a fraud. And this needs to be distinguished from people, particularly who are in minoritized groups, women, racial minorities in the US, people with ADHD, who are actively discriminated against and told that they are worthless because of some trait or characteristic of who they are. So again, the social stereotyping discrimination needs to be just separated and clearly defined or identified as something other than imposter syndrome. The other thing is, if you are an imposter, then hopefully you should fear being exposed or defrauded. And people with ADHD, or in general people who have neurodivergent thinking, are more susceptible to imposter phenomena because they are achieving their success more likely through unconventional pathways or goal or routes or mechanisms. So it makes sense that they themselves and that those around them may question their successes. Um, One of the viewers of the video also pointed out an aspect I did not get into too much, and that is there can be imposter syndrome thoughts, feelings regarding ADD itself. So some people have said, "Oh, you're a doctor, you're an architect, or you're a lawyer. You couldn't possibly have ADHD," which is clearly not the case. So there can be feelings that maybe I don't really have ADHD, maybe it was misdiagnosed, or feelings that I clearly have it, and others aren't believing that it's there or exists. So all of those are potential complications. Jumping over to the other video, so some of the video went through some of the genetic complexity of ADHD. So there can be not just single genes leading to dopamine receptor transporter variants, but there can be what are called copy number variants. So huge stretches of thousands of base pairs of DNA can be duplicated or deleted, and that can contribute. There can be mitochondrial genes that contribute. There can be polygenic effects, so that hundreds, if not thousands, of genes, each having a tiny, tiny effect on the increased likelihood of ADHD. And there can certainly be epigenetic effects, where how the DNA is modified, or with methyl groups or histones are phosphorylated, or other chemical manipulations to either activate or inactivate the genes that are already there. But the big thrust of this article or this video was a recent study done out of big 1 million kids in Sweden. So they looked at all the kids born in a 10-year period. They had good medical records, so they knew who had ADHD. And in some ways, this study was a extended, conceptually, um, version of twin studies. So they actually excluded all twins from this test, but they looked at people who had different genetic relationships. So they looked at siblings, they looked at half siblings, and they looked at cousins. So siblings should share half your genes on average. Half siblings should share a quarter of your genes. Cousins should share an eighth of your genes. But they then looked at the genetic effect on maternal nurturance, and that's how much of an effect the mother's genes have on creating a certain environment. And there again, they um, the degree of to which two different individuals are sharing a similar maternal setting could be defined in different types of cousins have different relationships in that dimension. Anyway, they found that direct mother's direct genetic input into influencing whether a kid has ADHD was about, I think, 66% of the um, contributing about 66% of the likelihood, but another 14% was due just to genetic nurturance. And again, that is how mother's genes shape the environment she creates for raising her kid who may or may not then develop ADHD. So they didn't break down what were the components of that genetic nurturance. They just offered hypotheses that some of it could be her stress level, patterns of behavior like maternal smoking. We know that ADHD itself affects financial status. So mother's financial status then may affect the environment that her kid is growing up in. So they didn't break down what were the components of the genetic nurturance, but showed that it was a significant extent. Um, so that's there. And I see there's a whole bunch of questions. So I will try to start addressing them. So Jack asks, if a kid who only has autism takes ADHD meds, could this help to regulate his sleep schedule? And it's an interesting question. And I would say, for sort of philosophically or scientifically, it makes sense that that's plausible. I guess the question is whether that would be the best way to help regulate sleep schedule. I mean, I would almost always start out with strong light dark schedules and getting exposure to bright light early in the morning and minimizing it towards the end of the day, and using other behavioral approaches to have a regular bedtime, have a regular wake up time, and reduce activities that are disruptive later in the day, like vigorous exercise. So, whether the cost benefit value of um, an ADHD meds, I guess, can doesn't necessarily mean stimulants. So, if you could use something like Wellbutrin, that would probably mitigate or avoid some of the more uncommon but potentially severe side effects of the stimulants themselves. And Frijan points out that it's hard to know sometimes whether someone really only has autism. There may be other conditions contributing. Um, and then talking about clonidine, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll. And hello, Dennis. So Dennis asks, is it true that serotonin is an anti-stress neurotransmitter? So I would say that's a more philosophical than a neuroscience question. I mean, I guess we could say at some level, norepinephrine being the primary neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system, and overarousal and drive would be a stress neurotransmitter. Um, but to me, it would be too simplistic to say serotonin is an anti-stress. I mean, serotonin is a numerically tiny system. Numerically a set of tiny systems that are starting out in the um, base of the brain and sending ramifications, axons, controlling, modulating lots and lots of other different circuitry. Um, so, in general, is serotonin helping with calming down? I'd say that's a fair statement, but to me, it's just a little overly simplistic to call it an anti-stress neurotransmitter. Hello again, James Alexander. So James asked, do you think the share of ADHD patients who would find significant symptom relief from wakefulness agents like modafinil, armodafinil is smaller than the share of ADHD patients who would benefit from second-line treatments like Cymbalta, Strattera, Qelbree, and Tuniv, and Kepe. So one thing so there is a study, and I sometimes have trouble finding it when I'm searching for it, done out of Brown University, maybe 6, 8 years ago, that actually compared modafinil to, I think it was methylphenidate, a classic stimulant. And they had a clever protocol, and I'm not even remembering the details of it, where they were trying to separate out motivational factors from more purely, it's a cognitive improvement, executive function improvement. And in their study, modafinil actually was not just an alertness wakeness, but was actually doing more for cognitive executive function, whereas and this was a study looking at benefit for ADHD, that most of the stimulants benefit was through aiding motivation rather than actually helping with explicit cognitive executive function. So that is an interesting study in which to evaluate this question. I'd say empirically, I've seen a smaller number of people who felt that modafinil or armodafinil helped their ADHD than I've seen. I'd say I get a higher rate of people expressing that they're noticing benefit for their ADD with these other second line agents compared to modafinil. But so just numerically, that's what I'd say. Hello, Max. So Max asks, have you seen any research that looks at whether having a single parent with ADHD versus both parents having ADHD affects the severity of the child's ADHD if they do end up having it? And he's suggesting I need the microphone even closer. I feel like I'm about to swallow it, but I will try. I don't recall seeing any studies, but I would not be surprised if they're out there already. One of the interesting studies from this Swedish gene nurturance effect did find that there was significant assortative mating. So the people with ADHD in their study were more prone to pair with other ADHD individuals to have children. Um, so to me, it's plausible that if you have both parents with ADHD, whether it's polygenic or multiple single strong genetic effects, or even multiple sources of copy number variant issues, um, that that presumably the two parents are not contributing the exact same genetic predisposition, and therefore the cumulative effect of the two together would be a bigger genetic load or bigger risk factor. So, to me, it's extremely plausible, but I don't know if we have specific studies substantiating that. James Alexander asks, what's the highest dose of modafinil and the highest dose of armodafinil you've seen patients try above the FDA recommended maximums? I don't know that I've seen too many people try above. So with modafinil, the FDA approved dose upper limit is 400 milligrams. And I've had some people who feel they had marked success at doses as low as 25. I'd say more often I see benefit, if they're going to have benefit, in 1 to 200. I have had some people who felt noticeably more benefit at 400 than 200. And my recollection is anyone who went above that only had minimal improved benefit or didn't see any added benefit, so went back down to 400. And also with armodafinil, I'd say where the upper FDA suggested limit is 250 milligrams. I don't think I've had anyone in a sustained fashion on higher doses than that. Part of what might have contributed is that for years these were both quite expensive medications, and insurance companies were very reluctant to cover them. So they would almost certainly not have covered dosages above the FDA limit. But again, that might be a small factor, but I don't think it's a primary factor. I just think that most of the individuals who got benefit felt that they were getting significant benefit in the FDA suggested range and minimal benefits higher. So Dennis asks, in Europe, some psychiatrists have a DPM, which stands for Diploma in Psychological Medicine, in addition to their medical training. Is there anything similar in the USA? So I'm not aware of anything similar. So in terms of the training in the US, someone typically has 4 years of undergraduate college work. I finished in just 3, but I was an oddball. And then they go on to 4 years of medical school. So this is not exactly the same as in the US. Um, and then after 4 years of medical school for psychiatry, there is 4 years of psychiatry residency training. The first half year, or in the first year, there's a half year of general medical internship, including at least a month of neurology. Um, so I don't think most, I mean, some psychiatrists certainly go on to specific psychoanalytic training. That's decreasing in popularity over the years, but that would be one set of formal training beyond it. There's more variability in terms of psychology degrees. So there generally are PhDs in either clinical psych or research psychiatry or psychology, sorry. But there are also, at some schools, were, I don't know if they even continue, just a doctorate, not a PhD, a doctorate in psychology programs. And there are only a handful of those. And I don't know in what ways their training differed from a PhD in psychology. So Mr. AKA asked, is fluoxetine mostly taken in the morning? And that's most often how it's recommended or prescribed. Fluoxetine has, and its metabolite norfluoxetine have very long half-lives. So on the order of 10 to 14 days, which means that in contrast to most other of our particularly other SSRIs and other antidepressants whose half-life is about a day, where there are more marked fluctuations day to day in your blood level, just depending on when you take it. That what the dose you take each day of fluoxetine is only a few percent of the total amount in your blood, but that can still, so there, if you take it in the morning, your level will be slightly higher for the next few hours than it is the rest of the day. And for some people, fluoxetine is um, activating. So again, even though it will be showing less throughout the day fluctuations in a shorter acting or shorter half-life antidepressant, that still has some impact. James Alexander asks, what do I think about venlafaxine as a treatment for ADHD compared to Cymbalta? So if you asked me that in 1995, in the US, venlafaxine or Effexor was the first SNRI on the market. If you don't include some of the tricyclic antidepressants, which are primarily SNRI by action. So venlafaxine is two things. It has substantially stronger serotonin than norepinephrine reuptake, and at least in laboratory situations, you need to be above 100 milligrams before you're getting, for most individuals, any significant impact on norepinephrine systems. Whereas Cymbalta is in favor, more strongly acting on serotonin. It's a much more balanced system, and you're getting substantial norepinephrine reuptake action at the lowest dose. Since all of our available evidence suggests that norepinephrine reuptake is much more important than serotonin reuptake for treating ADHD symptoms. That would make Cymbalta a better option, or more likely a more potent option across the broad range of dosages. The other issue is that Effexor's half-life and how tightly it binds to the transporter molecule, and um, it causes more withdrawal problems than Cymbalta does. Cymbalta is not benign. So Cymbalta is probably worse than most of the SSRIs except for Paxil paroxetine. But venlafaxine and Paxil very consistently are the two commonly used antidepressants with the highest rate of withdrawal effects, and with Effexor, I would not use the immediate release form at all, but even the extended release, which is what was widely available in the US, many people are have withdrawal the next day. So 20 hours, 22 hours after they took a dose, they're into withdrawal each day with it. Not huge percentages, but more problematic than Cymbalta that way. Again, in the early 90s, before Cymbalta came out, I certainly treated people with venlafaxine. There are a small number of studies looking at it. It is effective for ADHD. And if we're looking at SNRI specifically, milnacipran, which is Vetsima and Savella, one of them is only I think the left-handed enantiomer of milnacipran. That is actually, in many ways, a better match in that it is either slightly stronger for norepinephrine or more equally balanced than Cymbalta. Norepinephrine and serotonin reuptake actions, that for them, the ideal combination was a certain dose of Cymbalta with a certain dose of Vetsima, that if it was all Vetsima or Vetsima, all milnacipran, that was too revving up. And if it was only Cymbalta, that felt too numbing, sedating, calming maybe. So an ideal balance was somewhere in between the two. So Max asks, what factors do I take into account for deciding whether to add an SSRI like Prozac in combination with stimulant medication for ADHD without comorbidities? I'd say if there weren't comorbidities, I probably wouldn't be thinking particularly strongly. I mean, the two comorbidities particularly would be social anxiety or depression, where I would be thinking of adding an SSRI. I know, and I'm blanking on his name, the guy who's Daniel Amons, who, depending on his books, has 9 or 11 or 14 distinct types of ADHD, where he claims he can identify from your PET scans, although others have not replicated it, and he's never published his protocols for such diagnostic regimens. I mean, he thinks that there are certain of his forms of ADHD which respond well to SSRIs. I would say that all of the published data and literature on SSRIs show that they can be helpful for comorbidities, they can be helpful for OCD, they can be helpful for depression, they can be helpful for social anxiety, but outside of that, most studies do not find that they are effective for treating core symptoms of ADHD. So I certainly ask a follow-up if that didn't cover what you're referring to. So KK asks, can ADHD be prevalent in certain small ethnic communities? I notice patterns of behavior that have led to centuries of poor decision-making, resulting in mass exodus of the population due to ADHD. There's certainly been relation to that effect. I mean, there have been claims that, you know, that ADHD is more prevalent in the Jewish population. There's been inconsistency in results demonstrating that. I mean, it's pretty clear that ADHD is prevalent on every continent in this current Earth. And if you use fairly similar methods of ascertaining whether there's ADHD, we're not finding markedly different rates of ADHD among different racial groups. I do have one of my older videos, I think, was on racial ethnic patterns in ADHD. Yeah, when we're talking about mass exodus of the population, and particularly when we're talking historical records, whether things like that were due to ADHD or due to persecution, and persecution could be any number of different religious or other factors. So it's an interesting question. I mean, there's some people who think that the US and maybe Australia are overrepresented in ADHD because ADHD contributed to itinerancy, wanting to get up and move to a different place, or being pioneers, or being um, just less satisfied with the status quo and willing to move on. And therefore, those people were overrepresented in early settlers, and contributed their genetic legacy to the country as a whole. I think overall the evidence is small for those theories. That doesn't disprove them at all. So Max is pointing out that the actual feeling of brain fog seems pretty well described by its name. Is it a medically recognized term? What was it called before it was labeled as brain fog? Do we know why, how it happens? So I do have, pretty sure I have a, so no, it is not an officially medically recognized term. Particularly in COVID research, I mean, some researchers try to conflate it with lethargy or fatigue, which most people would say is a distinct dimension, even though they can happen together. Some define it as confusion or cloudiness, again, not precise medical terms. The most consistent finding, and a growing body of science, implicates inflammation, brain inflammation specifically, as a major contributor. Um, and there can be lots of different pathways towards inflammation. So again, I do have a video on that. I also talk about it a little bit in terms of traumatic brain injury, and I'll share my own experience. So it was 93, 94. I was riding my bike actually to Friday after work to go to psychotherapy. Um, yeah, for my psychotherapy at the time. Was going down a moderately, not a very steep hill by San Francisco standards, and I'm a very cautious biker. But I was going at a fairly decent speed, entered an intersection on the panhandle of Golden Gate Park, and saw three cars and stopped at a light. So they had a red light. They were waiting to make left-hand turns. So when I was nearing the intersection, I saw that they were all stopped and that I had a green light. It was fine for me to go. And then my next recollection is just a flash where the lead car was taking a left-hand turn right in front of me. And in my nerdo fashion, my actual thought at the time was, "You idiot, we can't both be in the same place at the same time." That's my last recollection. Apparently, so the car had turned in front of me. I was coming down the hill. That's probably not useful with my hands. I hit the essentially passenger side, just near the hood. I flew over the hood. I was wearing a bike helmet. landed on my head, cracked the styrofoam in the helmet, was knocked out for about 2 minutes. Have a scar somewhere on my chin there, a cracked tooth, tinnitus since then. But getting back to the point of brain fog, for 2 weeks after that, I had daily headaches, which I never get headaches. I was running 4 or 5 marathons then. Fatigue was never a problem, so I had fatigue. I had mental cloudiness, brain fog, and I had tinnitus. And then the most weird sensation was vertigo, particularly not when I was sitting down, but when I was standing up, and particularly people moving around me. Um, so that was persistent for 2 weeks, and then, or maybe 9 or 10 days. I actually had a marathon to run in Portland, Oregon, and decided to go up anyway because I had a friend to visit. I went to the pre-race expo, which was horrible because it's thousands of people milling around, and I literally had to hold on to his elbow to sort of escort me through that. Decided to run the marathon the next day, and somewhere through the course of the marathon, so at the beginning of the marathon, I started further back so I wouldn't be tightly packed close to people. By the end of the marathon, the brain fog was gone. I mean, I was physically tired, so lethargy was there. Um, Vertigo was completely gone. Headaches were completely gone. It didn't return. Tinnitus didn't change. I still have that to this day. It's mild. Um, but my theory, so at the time, the strong recommendations were if you have any traumatic brain injury, if you have a concussion, rest, 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 rest. And the message I got from that, and it's interesting because only in the last few years, they're moving in the direction I was thinking we should go. And that is, I think for me, the running the marathon, and I'm not recommending everyone who gets a concussion should go run a marathon, and running might not be the best one, but aerobic exercise, whether it was increasing circulation and flushing out immune chemicals, whether it was over the course of the marathon, you're causing inflammation in muscles because the trauma of running that long, and that the immune system cells then gravitate to different locus than they were up in my brain. I don't know which of those factors, but I soundly, sincerely, completely believe that was it. And again, there's been some research study, again, maybe not the pounding of running, but getting on an exercise bike, doing some even fairly vigorous exercise after concussions can probably help reduce brain inflammation. So there's also some studies looking at simple anti-inflammatory agents. The compounding factor is many of those of coagulation and bleeding, which, depending on what kind of brain trauma you've had, you might not want to do. Um, but there's lots of research looking at trying to reduce brain inflammation. And again, many of the drugs I've talked about, so things like amantadine, um, almost certainly lion's mane, probably all are methylene blue, may all be good things to take in brain fog states, but not a lot of controlled research yet. And again, part of it gets back to how do you define brain fog, given that most of that is a subjective feeling. So, so thanks for indulging me in oversharing of my brain fog and traumatic brain injury. So Max asked, when saying anything that may get you in trouble, if it came to the point that your government banned SSRIs or stimulants, would you be willing to risk your career freedom to keep treating your patients? So I'm going to answer a couple different levels. One is sort of at a pragmatic level. If the government banned it, then presumably pharmacies wouldn't be able to fulfill orders. So there wouldn't be. It's hard for me to imagine an avenue where if the government says you can't use this drug, that there's any practical way I could actually would be able to prescribe it. I mean, maybe using Canadian pharmacies or other routes there, I mean, which would be easily traceable and surveyable. I mean, right now, all prescriptions in all states in the US are strongly encouraged to be electronic prescriptions. There's some emergency provisions if systems are down, but all prescribing is electronic, which means it's extremely easily monitored and or um, can be intercepted or just blocked if any. I mean, they could just block anything for an SSRI or a stimulant. So at a pragmatic level, it's hard to imagine a scenario where they would say where they would ban it, and yet there'd still be some possible way to be prescribing it. Um, a couple other so in my talk on the DEA regulations, which may be coming into effect, um, many of those may be putting me out of business. I mean, one of them that was proposed is that right now all my work is remote, and one of the provisions is if you prescribe stimulants, or maybe it's only Schedule 2 stimulants like Adderall and methylphenidate, then at most half of your prescriptions can be remote, and the other half or more have to be in person. How they would monitor that, how they would determine that, whether it would actually be half your patients or half your prescriptions, or if you write for 3 months at a time versus 1 month, is that a 3 month versus a 1 month prescription? I mean, there's lots of silly logistics, but technically that would mean I couldn't prescribe any stimulants to anyone. So I'm happy to speak out against the stupidity of the government. And it's not just stupidity, it's mendacity, it's outright lying and deception. Part of it is that, I mean, my biggest worry or concern is my patients, not me. I'm at an age where many of my peers have retired. I think my 35th medical school class is having its graduation celebration reunion this fall. And when I looked, more than half the people across different specialties are already retired. So I, if I retired, I'd be spending more time writing and talking on YouTube. But I don't know. I think many of the people I work with who are on Medicare or Medicaid or other restricted, um, don't have insurance. Whether they would be able to find care is questionable. So I don't know if I've answered the question. So I think the time to be speaking up is beforehand. So that's part of why I released and wrote an article on Medium about the DEA rules. So the DEA rules are certainly going to restrict access, and particularly those who are going to be most restricted are people who rely most on telehealth, who there's an overrepresentation of people who have multiple mental health issues, who have um, income restrictions, who have, I mean, some people who need it the most that we're going to be hurting the most, which is consistent with a number of other Trump era MAGA policies, including money that hurt their own voters. So I'll stay out of the politics beyond that, unless things come up. So Mr. AKA, as I just thought of something, ADHD phenotype is like ApoE4. They had benefit in pre-modern society, but absolutely terrible nowadays. ApoE4 is good for anti-parasite. So ApoE4 is one of the cholesterol processing genes, is what I'll call it. And it's one that has a moderately strong association with developing Alzheimer's disease. But there's some evidence that it was evolutionarily helpful. So I mean, when we make evolutionary arguments, what I can say is if a gene is prevalent, all we can say is that there's some value to preserving it, and we can create our own stories or scenarios. So there's the hunter-gatherer, Tom Hartman's hypothesis, which there's some sort of circumstantial evidence for. What I would say the evolutionary value of ADHD is, I think, and I have a video that talks a little bit about this and ADHD and sex. If you have something that makes you tend to procreate at an earlier age with less consideration, maybe of who you're screwing around with, there's several aspects of ADHD that make it more likely you will have more kids. Whether that's true in modern society is some evidence suggesting. Um, so even though ADHD and maybe even back then was related to higher mortality, if the net result was again getting more genes into the next generation because you had more kids, even if more of them died, but proportionally your procreative value is higher than your loss from accidents, that in itself would be a more direct explanation for why it persists so far. So James Alexander asks, why do I think the only antidepressants approved by the FDA and typically used by psychiatrists for ADHD in the US are selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, atomoxetine and viloxazine? So viloxazine, I wouldn't say is a selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. I'm a little, I'm not, um, well, so I mean, what the FDA approves is highly dependent on what the manufacturers decide to bring to market. So, for example, Eli Lilly was the manufacturer of Cymbalta. Again, it was the second SNRI. It got approved when it was approved initially, both for generalized anxiety, and for um, certain chronic pain syndromes, diabetic neuropathy, and a few others. Pain indications have been expanded. So they had certain markets they were trying to capture with this drug. There were no other um, pain medications that work by this mechanism. And Eli Lilly released Strattera, I think it was a few years before Cymbalta. But again, there was already preliminary data, that duloxetine Cymbalta was effective for ADHD. But they had, at that time and for a decade, Strattera was the only non-stimulant approved for ADHD. So they didn't want to compete against themselves. They didn't want to muddy the water. It was purely a marketing decision not to go to get an FDA indication for ADHD for um, Cymbalta, duloxetine. So a lot of so what winds up on the market? Yes, the FDA has a role in deciding or approving, but I'd say a bigger shaper is what the pharmaceutical companies, where they see there's competition. So along the same lines, um, in the US, the first 4 SSRIs approved were Prozac fluoxetine, Paxil paroxetine, sertraline Zoloft, and then substantially later, citalopram. Maybe citalopram was even after. Anyway, there are 3 big big drugs promoted by big manufacturers. And when fluvoxamine, saw approval, they didn't think they could break into the antidepressant market, and they went for OCD, approved for OCD, and there is not a shred of evidence that I've ever seen that among the SSRIs, Luvox is at worse as an antidepressant than the others. Nope. Is it better for OCD than the others? Nope. But are there still plenty of doctors who will only use, if they're going for an SSRI, fluvoxamine, and will never use fluvoxamine for depression because it's not doesn't have an FDA indication? Yep. So FDA indications do steer some of the market, but not all of the market. Um, so, so other than so why? I mean, I think the number there is so small that it's hard to generalize beyond that. And what I was saying, so aloxazine Qelbree was approved decades earlier in Great Britain for depression. And again, the studies are that it worked well for that. It was identified as a pure, simple norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor then. And maybe because it was in a class by itself, it was not because of serious side effects. It wasn't because of common side effects. It just wasn't ever used that widely. And for marketing reasons, they took it off the market. And then a different company bought rights to it and decided to repurpose it for ADHD. And then in the research leading up to its approval as Qelbree for ADHD, um, the functional impact on, no. So if I haven't, so I'm trying to parse the whole sentence or question, which is going over three little chats. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of confirmation bias. There's a lot of follow the leader. There's a lot of we want to be first or second, but not fourth. But maybe being first sometimes has its own risks. Again, and in the U.S., it's perfectly fine and ethical and legal to use a drug for an a non FDA approved use if there is some reason, and that could be the doctor's own clinical experience. It preferably would be some published studies showing it is effective, even if it isn't approved. So if I've botched the answer, James Alexander, because I didn't read all the components of the question, redirect me, but I'll sort of move on from that one now. Jeremy Hill, you're welcome. He's thanking me. What words of encouragement would I have for someone considering a career in clinical mental health counseling? I'd say particularly if you have ADHD or on the ADHD spectrum. I go back all the time. I did not coin this, but I think it's tremendously helpful. ADHD brains tend to be interest driven. So if this is something that you're interested in, that's great because you are likely to continue to have some passion and that will help motivate you. And that's more important than the fact that it's important or valuable. Um, so I'd say pursuing something that's interesting and hopefully rewarding and potentially some of your own personal experiences may help with the value you bring to that. What else? And certainly there is no shortage, as anyone who looks around the world can see, and we need more mental health counseling out there from the top all the way down to the bottom of societies. Good morning, Boris. Borislav. So Borislav says different narcissism facets are associated with distinct resting state brain activity, grandiose exhibitionism with reduced dorsomedial prefrontal cortex activation, entitlement and exploitativeness with reduced dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, as well as right lateral prefrontal cortex activation and leadership. Um, so I'm not hearing a question there. I'm not aware of the exact studies, but it doesn't seem to me surprising that different facets of something we lump together have different pathways contributing to how it is evoked. Um, so Max, thanks, brought up the video on ADHD and sex. So I'm not. So that so to follow up a little bit on the James Alexander question on marketing and medications. So a couple things. One is it does cost millions of dollars to bring any drug to market and to get the FDA testing done, and it's just not time. I mean, it's money is time as well as money. Um, but again, once it's on the market, it can be used for any purpose, but they're not allowed to promote it for off-label uses. So there's um, and companies have been fined tens of millions of dollars for promoting drugs for non-FDA approved uses. So it's a strange zone, in, and I don't know all the marketing strategies of, let's bring something to market and wink, wink, suggest, indicate, let people know it can be used for other purposes, but we can't actively promote it for that. So Max points out the definition of a delusion seems pretty extensive. It sounds like it would encompass religion or even certain political beliefs. How do you approach such a sensitive topic in a clinical setting? Um, and particularly in this time, so I'll delve into politics more. So I'm old enough to have been engaged intelligently in political discussions in the 1980s when Ronald Reagan was president. And how that era, to my mind, is strikingly different than today's era was that there was basic agreement about the facts. Unemployment was this rate, inflation was this rate, the distribution of housing income was here or there, whatever it was. And the discussions were largely about philosophies and strategies. Should the government have a role in trying to reduce unemployment? Should they be focusing on inflation instead? Should we be reducing barriers to discrimination? But there was a common acceptance of fact. And I know everyone will not agree with me, but I think the facts are so overwhelmingly the case that starting with the Fox News era and starting with Newt Gingrich's approaches to confrontational politics, but for about 20, 25 years in the US, the Republican Party has been substantially less interested in adhering to any facts and willing to promote any. I'm not saying Democrats are always truthful. I'm not saying Democratic politicians haven't lied, but what we're seeing, you know, now is just a basic just the continued discussion. Did Trump win the 2020 election? More than 60 lawsuits, more than dozens of audits recounting, often by companies explicitly looking for fraud, looking for reasons to return the election to Trump because that's what their CEOs believed in, failing to find anything. And yet, more than a third of the Republican Party staunchly continues to believe, and leaders all the way from the president to Speaker of the House to numerous senators perpetuating lies, and that's just one lie. So how do you define delusions when certain people are promoting lies that they know are lies, but that their followers may believe? So again, part of a delusion, the definition of delusion is persisting in a set of beliefs that are have been refuted by the evidence. Now, the tricky thing here is if you have leaders who are swearing, essentially providing false evidence, then you could easily omit. You can say these aren't delusions; these are just propaganda. So propaganda isn't a delusion. Um, so how do you be sensitive to? I mean, a couple things with delusions. With someone really believing in their delusions, often just presenting them with the factual information does very little to dissuade them because usually the delusions are part of a greater mindset or philosophy or approach. So, trying to convince someone who believes the earth is flat that it's not flat, usually, they'll just deny your evidence and resort to the arguments that they found convincing. So, in a clinical situation, so on the other hand, I think there is a value to reasserting facts. So, if a patient comes in, I had a patient who was this in the first Trump administration after there were some advertising campaigns with clear Jewish stereotypes with people with hooked noses and bags of money, and it was an attack ad. I mean, it was clearly relying on anti Semitic tropes that have been widely used and propagated, and Trump engaged in them. And this patient came in saying, well, Trump has a Jewish son in law. How he can't possibly be anti Semitic. So to me, it was reasonable to challenge that belief that just because someone had Jewish relatives, you can be Jewish yourself and you can be anti Semitic. So um, I think it's worth confronting falsehoods where falsehoods exist. I don't think it's my job to switch anyone's political or religious philosophies or beliefs. Um, I'd say by nature, most of the core of it is based on faith. It's not based on fact. So there, my thought is, I mean, you can argue about intelligent design and creationism or evolution, and I would say the facts there suggest that either evolution by natural selection is really occurring and has occurred on Earth for several 100 million years, or you have to believe that God wants any intelligent person to believe that's so, because he's created so many lines of completely separate, independent evidence, whether it's genetic relatedness or a fossil record or the dating of fossils through completely separate physical clocks that don't rely on each other, but all give you the same answers. That can't happen just by random chance. Um, anyway, so thanks. So moving on from that, unless there's follow up, Boris um, has produced a link about the brain activation, differential brain activation in different areas by different aspects of narcissism. So James Alexander says if you go online, some people say their medication doesn't work if they eat breakfast. Some say if it doesn't, it doesn't. If they don't eat breakfast, if they eat breakfast, and some if they don't eat protein, fat, or other specific foods for breakfast. While trialing ADHD medication, should the average patient expect the ones that work to work under any of these circumstances? So one thing I don't want to devalue anyone's individual experience, but what I will say is people who have unusual experiences are overrepresented on online chat groups, and some of them are particularly vehement, partly because they don't see their experience represented elsewhere and want people to know that their experience is real. But it creates an outsized emphasis or an overemphasis or the impression that this problem is much more common than is perceived when or but usually it's they're making the case that creating something to be more prominent than it actually is in its existence or reality. So I do have a video on sort of all the processes, absorption, I guess I think it might have been food or acid base, acid base balance can have some impact. For most people, is that having a major impact on their ADHD medications? No. So I'd say for most of the medications we have, I mean, there's certainly a few Latuda antipsychotics, few other medications where they are considerably twice as well absorbed with a fatty meal than without, but none of the ADHD medications are commonly strongly affected, is the simple bottom line. That doesn't mean there might be some individuals who have a noticeable effect. There may be a noticeable effect on ADHD symptoms from just having breakfast or not for some people. So again, separate from a medication interaction effect. But from most of our ADHD drugs, for most people, all the food, non-food are minor contributors. So usually what I recommend when we're starting a new medication is to not change anything that you were doing already beforehand, unless we know you were doing something sort of bizarre, like taking 4 cups of grapefruit juice every morning, which does have some impact on the metabolism of certain drugs. But other than sort of weird outliers, I'd like to just change one variable at a time, and the introduction of the new drug should be that without changing diet simultaneously. So Jack's following up on his question about, so could clonidine or guanfacine be good to regulate an autistic child's sleep schedule? Yeah, so clonidine, I'm not a huge fan of. I mean, so both clonidine and guanfacine are alpha 2 adrenergic drugs, working the same way, both originally for blood pressure. Clonidine is very clearly associated with withdrawal phenomena, whereby someone's blood pressure, so when they stop abruptly, blood pressure can skyrocket, not just to where it was before they received treatment, but to dangerously high levels. Guanfacine theoretically has the potential for that, but it seems to let go of the receptors much more gradually, and its half life differs. So, in formal testing looking for it, it seems quite uncommon with guanfacine, and a distinct possibility with clonidine, and particularly, I mean, maybe with an autistic child, it's less of an issue, but with someone with ADHD, where skipping, forgetting, missing, forgetting to refill it is going to cause a problem. That's why I prefer guanfacine. So again, I would try behavioral approaches before I tried medications. Guanfacine can help some people sleep better and may help regulate sleep schedule. It's not at the top of the list of improving sleep drugs for me, but again, it may have other indirect benefits in the prefrontal cortex and reducing inflammation and improving synaptic connectivity. So Boris is asking about a new drug for autism in the US. I'm not aware of what's been approved. Um, yeah, so I'll just pass on that one. And I'm realizing I'm over, so I'll sort of speed through the last. So James Alexander is following up on one of the past Q&As that it would be probably easier to use gene editing to make a person as smart as Einstein than to cure a person of ADHD. Why is this the case? Um, I mean, the presumption there, and I'm not sure I agree with it, or I'm not even sure how we would define or measure as smart as Einstein. The, I think the underlying presumption is that what made Einstein as smart as he was probably one or two unusual genes or a small number of genes that aren't common displaying themselves, whereas at least a significant contribution for most people with ADHD is the effect of hundreds, it was polygenic effects. So again, there are some family lineages where a dopamine receptor or transporter or other gene is implicated and having a strong role in that family. But for the general, um, the impact of strong specific genes is probably overall in the community wide look at what the genetic effects are, probably in the 10 to 20% range. So a minor effect. So you'd probably, for a typical person with ADHD, if you're trying to change the polygenic impact, that would be potentially hundreds of genes you'd need to change. So thanks, Max, for providing the link to the food acidity, which again talks more than just about acidity. Um, Um, Thanks for showing up. Thanks for the great questions and the follow up questions. I'll be back next week, same time, same place. And Max is also, I did speak at Medium Day a little bit on writing for an ADHD world. And Max is also pointing out that the Reddit channel is there for people who want to engage in longer conversations or more in depth back and forth. Um, So have a good week. Stay healthy, stay happy, and try to stay sane in this world.